Okay, you want to go ahead, Joe? Yeah.
Sure. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Trump, I Do Mind Dying, Lessons for US Cities from the Anti-Apartheid Struggle in South Africa. We're hoping to have a great discussion ahead and we're going to get right to it in a moment. But first, a few words of background about the organizations involved and what we're seeking to do together with this conversation and series of conversations. My name is Joe Guinan. I'm president of the Democracy Collaborative, TDC. We're a US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to community wealth building and political economic system change to build a democratic economy that we desperately need. In the United States at the moment, it's a very dangerous, febrile situation. We see a fusion of corporate and state power that's reminiscent, at the very least, of fascism. And there are almost daily provocations aimed at accelerating political violence and crackdowns and the erosion of democratic rights and freedoms. And with the moves towards the military occupation of democratic Black-led cities, we talked to our colleagues at the People's Network for Land and Liberation, and together we've decided to convene this series of workshops with activists from around the world with experience who have lived through and survived military occupations, dictatorships, authoritarian crackdowns. The first session we held together was in September, and it was with community activists from the north of Ireland with the experience of living with troops on their streets for an extended period. The second conversation today is about lessons from South Afrika and the anti-apartheid struggle and how they went about resisting and ultimately overthrowing apartheid. And so with that, let me turn to Callie Akuno and Edgar Batru of the People's Network for Land and Liberation, our partners in this series and this exercise, to allow them to introduce themselves and to set the table for today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Joe. Another good introduction. Welcome everybody who's joining us live for part 2 of this ongoing dialogue in series. Today we are happy to have some comrades from South Afrika join us to share some lessons. We're giving folks a warning. There have been a few technical challenges. It appears that Eddie and some other folks have been facing, so we're going to try to overcome those as best possible in the course of the next hour and a half that we hope that you all stay with us and join us for this timely kind of conversation. But to just, add a bit, particularly for a younger generation, South Afrika, the other USA, as we used to say, for the United States of America and what used to be the Union of South Africa, share a lot in common historically with cross-fertilization of our struggles historically, the Black liberation struggle and the South African struggle against apartheid and for national liberation. So some of this think of as a mutual exchange of how we learn from each other in the past, going back to some of the Black folks from the United States working to set up the ANC, the African National Congress, to joint influences coming from the civil rights struggle, the teachings of nonviolence that had many sources, but particularly from the study of ahimsa, coming from Gandhi, who was a resident of South Africa before moving back to his homeland in India, and disseminating those teachings that led up to the struggle against the past laws in South Africa in the 1950s, which led up to the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. And it's one of the critical periods within this conversation. We're hoping that Eddie and some other folks will be able to share with us lessons, particularly from the period of the 1950s through the 1990s, which was an acute period of struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa, where we witnessed kind of successive waves of military occupation in the way they kind of deepened the apartheid racist regime in South Africa, but communities found ways, as Joe laid out, not only to fight back, but to eventually defeat the apartheid regime and establish a new state. And we would be remiss to not say that that is what we're trying to do in our context, which is why I bring it up, so that there are parallels that we can draw upon. It looks like we've run into some more technical difficulties with Eddie. It looked like he dropped again. Is that right, Tandi? Am I seeing that correctly? Okay, well, we'll give it a second, you all, to see if we can get him back, if he can come back on, and we'll get straight to him as soon as he comes on. But to give some folks a background, we were looking to have two guests join us today. Eddie Sebi was going to be one, and then the other, we're hoping that we can get Gunnet Kaf to also join us. While we are waiting, I'll just share in brief Eddie's bio, and then Edgar can share with you Gunnet's bio. But Eddie is a South African Communist Party activist based in Thokoza, South Africa, and activist for over 40 years, among activists involved in leading student, youth, and civic movements. Also involved in labor movements. He was involved in including peace negotiations and structures in areas that were engulfed by political violence during the apartheid era, particularly by the apartheid security forces and the political formations allied with the apartheid regime during the apartheid government. He is currently involved in the South African Communist Party program, the People's Red Caravan, a program that is developing alternatives to the current posture that has been taken by the government and outsourcing whole-scale functions of the government. So it's deep kind of neoliberal privatization program, including day-to-day services. This program is about food security for people to live off of the land and be self-sufficient and more self-reliant. And this includes interventions in the health and education facilities that function with a number of struggles, particularly some of the ones, this is a little editorial on my end, that have been racked by the Trump regime's cutting of funding to USAID and other programs. And so this is just some of the bit of a background from Eddie. And Eddie, we're going to go ahead and just start with you. We know your system's coming off and on, but we're hoping that you can take up some of the first questions that we started with. It. Again, I'll just start with the first one since he's here.
Yes.
So one of the key things, I don't know, Ed, if you were able to hear our introduction.
No, unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear as the system kept on kicking me out, in and out.
Hopefully it allows you to stay with us. But to get us going, Ed, if you could, we know that there are different, particularly from the 1950s on, different waves of repression and different methods and strategies of repression that the apartheid regime used against the people and the people's movements. And each period required different adjustments from the movement. So I'm hoping that you can talk about, how the movement adjusted from the 1950s in the struggles against the pass laws to the 1960s with the emergence of the Black consciousness movement, and then the struggle in the 1980s and 90s, that led to the formation of the trade unions, to COSATU, to the United Democratic Front. So the different ways in which the people and the movements responded to the different types of repression.
Yeah. Well, according to the questions that Carly had sent me, I tried to do a bit of a write-up that I hopefully I'll send him to him as well. Is that between the 1950s and early 80s, South Africa, the apartheid regime systematically repressed and occupied Black communities through legislative framework designed for racial segregation, economic exploitation, and political oppression. This was achieved through a range of laws controlled by every aspect of Black South Africa's life, from location and movement to their education and political rights. Institutional segregation and displacement. The apartheid regime enforced racial separation through landmark laws that determined where black people could live, work, and own property, concentrating power and resources in the hands of white minority. Through Group Areas Act of 1950, the act mandated spatial separation of racial groups. It led to mass and forced removal of over 3.5 million blacks at a particular time. Colored and Indian people who were relocated from areas designated for white-only occupation. Well-known examples include, obviously, Sophiatown, that is being really famous near Johannesburg, and District 6 in Cape Town. Also, Bantustans, homelands were established through the promotion of so-called Bantu self-government in 1959. The government confined black South Africans to impoverished, barren, and overcrowded ethnic reserves known as homelands. This policy was central to Grand Apartheid, as it stripped black people of their South African citizenship and made them citizens of this pseudo-independent state. In townships, black townships were established outside urban centers to house black laborers. These settlements were overcrowded, under-resourced, and deliberately isolated from the infrastructure and services of the white cities. On economic exploitation. Am I still audible? On economic exploitation and control, the apartheid state policies were designed to ensure cheap and controlled labor force to benefit white economy. Pass laws. These were required black people to carry a reference book at all times in white designated areas. The books, colloquially known as Dompa's stupid person, detailed personal and employment information. Without a valid pass, a person faced arrest, fines, and deportation to a homeland. By the time the laws were repealed in 1986, they had resulted in over 70 million arrests. Kali, can you hear? Am I still with you on the platform?
You're still on the platform. We have you.
Pardon?
Keep going. We can still hear you. You're still there.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. There was migrant labor as well. The tax system forced young men to leave their families in rural areas to work low wages in the mines and the farms. The system of the migrant labor led to social disruptions and the breakdown of families and traditional communities. This also had a job reservation where black workers were excluded from skilled labor through the reservation policies and were denied the right to join formal system of industrial relations. Denied rights and brutal enforcement. Apartheid enforced through ruthless systems of legal administrative terror, violence, and institutional neglect. Inferior education, which was in the 50s, 1953, whereas Bantu education, separate and severely underfunded education for black children, designed to prepare them for menial labor. By the 1970s, the government spent 10 times more on white education than black education. State violence and security laws. The government implemented a battery of security legislation to suppress dissent, particularly the 1960s Sharpeville massacre laws like Terrorism Act of 1967 allowed indefinite detention without trial and created climate where torture and police brutality were routine. Judicial repression. The legal system was used as a tool of the apartheid state. Black South Africans often appeared before the biased white magistrates without legal representation, and judges routinely condoned police brutality, resistance, and the final years of apartheid. Despite brutal repression, black communities and their allies fiercely resisted apartheid, which ultimately led to its downfall. Growing resistance anti-apartheid like African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress led campaigns of mass protests, strikes, and boycotts. Internal pressure. By the 1980s, internal resistance grew increasingly militant with popular uprising in the townships. There was international pressure, condemnation from United Nations, and extensive international sanctions, including economic sanctions and arms embargo, helped to weaken apartheid regime. The dismantling of apartheid, mounting pressure forced the government to begin negotiations at the end of the late 1980s. Key anti-apartheid figures like Nelson Mandela were released in 1990, and the last apartheid laws were repealed by 1991. The first democratic national election obviously was held in 1994. In essence, white supremacy was a unique system of racial segregation, and white supremacy in South Africa had nearly lasted for 300 centuries. I think I tried to sum up the 50s activities right up to the 90s, although there were specific times, as you had indicated earlier on the questions that you've sent, in terms of the emergence of the Black consciousness movement, that I'll just delve into just now, when most of political parties were suppressed and banned. Let me just rush into it just now. During and after the Reserve Blue Consciousness movement in the late 1960s and 70s, the Black Consciousness movement emerged in the late 1960s as a response to a severe repression, including the banning of major anti-apartheid organizations and the imprisonment of leaders after the 1960s Sharpeville massacre. The apartheid responded to BCM's rise with intensified repression through mass arrests, bannings, orders against organizations like PPC, Black People's Convention, and SASO, South African Student Organization, and brutally murdered leaders such as Steve Biko in police custody after the 1976 Soweto uprising. However, this repression, particularly the violent response to the Soweto uprising, backfired, fueled further resistance by revealing the brutality of the regime, unifying opposition movements against it. Repression of the late 1960s obviously saw the banning of the ANC and the PAC. So the rise of the BCM gained momentum around the struggles with the strikes around 1972 and 1973 around Durban, where there was a clamp of the movement as well. The banning and the arrest of government, banned leadership of Black consciousness movement, including SASO and Black People's Convention in 1973. This was followed by the Soweto uprising, and the government responded brutally to response of the protests against students for the forcibly use of media of language of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction that led to a death of many unarmed students who were protesting. The crackdown that following the Soweto uprising resulted in the arrest and the torture of many PCM leaders, obviously, as I've stated earlier on, including Steve Biko and many other leaders. And then I'll go to the emergence of the Black Trade Union movement and the United Democratic Front. That was between the areas of the 70s and the 80s. During and after the emergence of Black Trade Union movement and United Democratic Front, during the apartheid era in South Africa, the Black Trade Union movement and the United Democratic Front faced systematic and violent suppression by the state. The oppression intensified as UDF organized labor gained strength, particularly during the 1980s, forcing both movements to adapt from strategic alliances to resist repressive government. Suppression of Black trade unions. The apartheid state used both legal and extra-legal means to crush the power of the Black workers, a vital part of its segregated economic system. As a background to this, in early mid 20th century oppression, The legal exclusion in legislation such as the Industrial Conciliation Act of 1924, later amendment, explicitly excluded black workers from the official definition of employee. This barred black unions from registering participation in collective bargaining or accessing official dispute mechanisms. Strikes were criminalized. National Labor Settlement of Dispute Act of 1953 prohibited criminalized strikes by African workers, though it did not officially ban the unions themselves. Political intimidation was the order of the day through a Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, used to ban numerous trade union leaders from participating in union activities, effectively dismantling the leadership of groups like South African Congress of Trade Unions, which was SACTU then. Forced underground, following the Sharpeville massacre, obviously, most of the leaders of the trade union movement were forced underground. And the resurgence and intensified repression in the 1980s. Durban strikes of 1973 by 60,000 workers marked the rebirth of the independent trade union movement, despite official repression. These unions grew and became a significant political force. The formation of COSATU in 1985 unified major unions and created a powerful politically oriented federation with nearly 500,000 members. Heightened repression in response to COSATU growing power, the government employed intensified repressive tactics in the late 1980s. This resulted in headquarters being invaded in the 80s and firebombed. Leaders were arrested and detained during the successive states of emergency. Laws were amended to further restrict labor actions such as banning sympathy strikes. The suppression of UDF. The UDF launched in 1983 as a broad non-racial coalition to coordinate resistance against apartheid. Its mass-based decentralized structure posed a new threat to the government, which responded with a campaign of violence and legal suppression. The tactics of suppression that were applied targeted violence. Key UDF leaders, activists were murdered by the state security forces. State-backed groups. Notable examples include, as you know very well, Matthew Koniwe and his comrades that were killed in Craddock in the Eastern Cape, that were found to have been killed and burnt in their cars. That was in 1985. A human rights lawyer who was murdered, the famous Victoria Mqenge. These were part of the suppression that was used by the state then. There were mass detentions. The apartheid government declared a series of state of emergencies beginning in 1985, arrested thousands of UDF members and activists, and this was followed by treason trials. State prosecutors pursued lengthy and expensive treason trials against UDF leadership, attempting to portray the organization as a violent treasonous proxy for the banned ANC. In 1998, it was obviously outrightly banned. Harassment and intimidation. Even in the early stages, police harassed activists, confiscated materials like pamphlets, reading materials, used violence to break up rallies. The post-emergency operation, the repression movements led to greater cooperation and formation of united resistance. After the unbanning of UDF in 1988, the mass democratic movement emerged at the banning of UDF, with COSATU being part of it, although it was restricted. The MDM continued the struggle against apartheid. It was difficult for the state to ban due to its amorphous structures. Continuing violence. Even as negotiations for the new South Africa began, violence continued, particularly in Natal, where clashes between UDF and Inkatha supporters escalated into a civil conflict. State security forces were often complicit in exacerbating this violence. The suppression ultimately failed to crush the anti-apartheid movement. The resilience of the unions and the UDF, combined with international pressure and economic factors, ultimately illustrated to government that black resistance could not be extinguished. The dismantling of apartheid legislation in the early 1990s marked the end of this systematic oppression. I think I would like to complete that particular part. I wouldn't know whether I should go into how the community responded in each of these to sustain itself in each of these eras. Can I go through?
Yeah, please go through. That would be very helpful.
Okay. Across eras of apartheid, the community response evolved from non-violent civil disobedience in the 1950s, increasingly militant, organized mass resistance in the 1980s. Throughout this period, resilience was maintained through a variety of community-led strategies, including political mobilization, economic boycotts, cultural expressions, and the development of alternative social and educational structures. 1950s defiance political organization. The 1950s saw the formalization of many apartheid laws and a surge in community-based political resistance. The African National Congress and its allies led non-violent mass campaigns that established broad-based multi-racial opposition to the state. Community responses. There were mass defense campaigns around 1952, launched of the defense campaign encouraging volunteers to deliberately violate petty apartheid laws by using whites-only facilities. The aim was to overwhelm the legal system with mass arrests, as it succeeded in boosting that action itself succeeded in boosting ANC membership, for instance, from 7,000 to 100,000. Women's mobilization. The Federation of South African Women and the ANC Women's League organized a mass women's anti-pass campaign on the August 9th, 1956, where 20,000 women famously marched to the union buildings in Pretoria to protest the extension of the pass laws to women. The Freedom Charter campaign. Following widespread consultation, the Congress of the People adopted the Freedom Charter in Cape Town in 1955. This document laid out a vision for a non-racial democratic South Africa and became the guiding political platform for the liberation movement. Forced removal resistance. When the state began forcing people out of neighborhoods like Sophiatown, communities protested by refusing to move through these efforts, though these efforts were ultimately suppressed. The 1960s saw the turn to the armed struggle. Following the 1960 Sharpeville massacre, where police shot and killed 69 people, protesters, the government banned ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress. This effectively closed the door on non-violent protests and led to a shift towards armed resistance and underground. The community response was the formation of the armed wings. The ANC and the PAC established military wings from Konto Wesizwe and Polko, respectively. These groups engaged in sabotage against government targets through MK, initially operated in a small, poorly equipped unit. Underground networks, the ANC underground structures and international connections became vital for sustaining the struggle after its leadership was arrested in Ravoni in 1963. The rise of Blue consciousness emerging from political vacuum. The Black consciousness movement, led by Steve Biko, focused on Black pride, self-reliance, and psychological liberation. It inspired new generation and fostered initiatives like Black community programs. The 1970s Black consciousness labor resurgence. The BCM provided a new assertive ideological basis for resistance, inspiring community development project and youth activism. Meanwhile, a wave of labor strikes demonstrated the critical economic power of Black workers. Community responses. Black community programs under the Black consciousness movement activists created self-help initiatives like clinics, community newspapers, and a fund to support families of political prisoners. These programs serve to both address community needs and instill a sense of Black empowerment. Student movements, the South African Student Organization and later South African Student Movement mobilized high school students against inferior Bantu education system. This culminated into the 1976 uprising, sparked the mandatory use of Afrikaans in schools, worker strikes, mass strikes in Durban and other industrial centers, alternative social structures. In the wake of intense suppression, communities experimented with developing their own institutions and precursor to the ungovernability strategies of the 1980s. The 1980s saw a mass actions and ungovernability, increasingly making the apartheid to be unworkable. A new wave of civic, student, and union movements coordinated resistance, prompting a brutal, ultimately failing to crack down by the state. Community responses, United Democratic Front, formed in 1983, was a broad umbrella coalition of anti-apartheid organizations, including student, civic, trade union movements, and other social movements, coordinated boycotts of the tricameral parliament that excluded the Black majority, and other mass campaigns with the aim of making townships ungovernable. Civic associations and street committees, as apartheid local council collapsed under pressure, community-run structures like residents association and street committees emerged to organize and enforce anti-apartheid actions like rent and consumer boycotts. Congress of South African Trade Unions, a federation which was formed in 1980, brought together a powerful Black trade unions. Also was part of mass strikes and embarked on consumer boycott, acting as a crucial organizing force after the state banned UDF. There was also church involvement. Organizations like South African Council of Churches provided moral and practical support, including emergency services, legal defense funds, scholarship for Black students. They also supported international sanctions campaign. You had even the End Conscription campaign. As the apartheid state militarized its response, the End Conscription campaign as a prominent anti-apartheid movement resisting military service. As you had at that particular time, young people who have just completed matric, who have finished 18, were conscripted to the army in defense of apartheid, and ECC was very crucial in resisting the conscription of young white people into the apartheid army at the particular time. How did the liberation forces organize themselves during these periods to sustain the struggle and build resistance? These structures evolved from non-violent, as I've indicated earlier. Political structures like in the SADC region of like Frelimo in Mozambique, ANC in South Africa, military wings. As political movements were banned, organizations formed wings to engage in sabotage and guerrilla warfare. You had military wings of APLA, which represented the Pan-Africanist Congress. But at the very same time, you had mass-based mobilization inside the country. Liberation forces organized broad movements to build internal resistance and mobilize communities. UDF acted as a legal umbrella organization for over 230 anti-apartheid groups in South Africa. Though non-aligned, it was sympathetic to the underground ANC and mobilized widespread resistance, including school boycotts and rent strikes. Mass democratic movements after UDF was restored in 1988 emerged as a loose coalition of anti-apartheid organizations. The MTM coordinated campaign of civil disobedience, including protests in white-only areas to defy state of emergency. Trade unions, particularly COSATU, organized workers and allied with political movements, providing another pillar of organized resistance through strikes, solidarity strikes, to to break the back of the economy of the country. Youth and student movements were the other elements. Student boycotts and youth movements, particularly after 1976 uprising, became critical source of new recruits of military wings and revitalized the struggle. Women organizations, women created their own structures, such as women wings of liberation movements and forums in trade unions, asserting their right to equality while participating in the broader thrust of the struggle. Operations in exile and international support, mainly liberation movements, were forced into exile, where they built extensive external networks to continue to fight, based and training camps of MK and ABLA were in the neighboring countries, the frontline states, and other African nations such as Angola and Tanzania. These camps provided military and political training for thousands of recruits. International diplomacy, movements like the ANC worked with solidarity organizations abroad, such as anti-apartheid movement, to build international pressure and secure support from sympathetic governments. Information dissemination. The exile structures maintain external communication networks, including radio freedom, to combat censorship and inform supporters inside the country and internationally. Of course, challenges, it was not easy or even smooth. There were challenges to the organization. Sustaining resistance required adapting to severe challenging from ruling regimes. State repression, apartheid government used state emergency, bannings, detentions, assassinations, and cross-border raids to destabilize liberation forces. Limited resource liberation movement often operated with limited resources and faced constant surveillance and infiltration by enemy agents. Pressure on host countries, neighboring African states that hosted liberation movements. Camps faced military incursions and destabilization efforts from South African regime. Agreements like Nkomati Accord forced some host nations to limit support from liberation movements. How did the movement build trust and unity between races and ethnic groups in order to overcome the divide and conquer the tactics of the state and the forces of capital benefiting from repression of the apartheid regime? The anti-apartheid movement built trust, unity between different racial and ethnic groups through coalition building, creating shared political programs like the Freedom Charter, engaging in joint campaigns, promoting non-racialism, and developing integrated structures. These strategies directly countered apartheid regime divide and conquer tactics, which were designed to exploit division to maintain power. Multiracial alliances, coalition building. The anti-apartheid movement was not a single entity, but a broad strategic alliance of various organizations, including African National Congress, South African Indian Congress, the Colored People Congress, and the Congress of Democrats, a wide anti-apartheid group. Defiance Campaign of 1952 was one such example of this collaboration in terms of defeating the divide and rule of apartheid. The 1955 Freedom Charter adoption, where 3,000 delegates, was one such. UDF was a broad coalition as well of hundreds of anti-apartheid organizations that mobilized against apartheid government attempts at constitutional reform. It united diverse groups, including students, trade unions, community organizations, sports bodies, and churches as well, to be part of it. Promotion of non-racialism as a core principle. Shared struggle, the movement taught people that source of their problems was not each other, but apartheid system itself. By emphasizing a shared political status of oppressed people, leaders help diverse groups see their common purpose. Inclusive structures, integrated organizations and campaigns such as the Multiracial Women's March of 1956 were critical for breaking down mutual suspicion and fostering a sense of shared purpose. Foundational documents like Freedom Charter solidify that commitment as well. I shall pause there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think it would be good if we brought in Gunet into the conversation as well, before we run out of time. Um, Gunet, are you
Hi,
there?
I'm here. I'm
Hi.
here. Mm.
Welcome. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Garnet, yes, Garnet Car.
Ganet. Ganet.
Yes.
Okay.
Comrade
Well,
Eddie.
welcome. Just to introduce you briefly, we know you are a longstanding political activist and a writer in the field of politics and economics. You served as a leader in the student movement, both in the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. And you continue to be a community activist, and we're very honored to have you here with us. Um,
Thank you.
Perhaps you could just talk a little bit about your experience and then your advice to us here in the United States who are currently experiencing, the Trump regime's efforts to consolidate, to construct a dictatorship essentially, and to start the kind of domestic repression that was experienced by your student movements, back in the day. If you have any experiences and advice you'd like to share with us.
Okay. So thank you. I'm honored to participate in this webinar and share some perspectives and experiences from South Africa. Hi, Comrade Eddie. Um, so, so I think I should start off by a personal note. So my generation, we joined at the tail end of the struggle against apartheid in the late 80s. So even though it was at the end, but it was still very tense, repression was still very much heightened. The security forces within the state were still very much active. So anything could have still have happened. So this is 88, 89. Mandela gets released in 1990. Mandela gets released not because of the benevolence of the apartheid regime, but because of the heightened pressure that had been put to the apartheid regime through mass struggles in the 80s. The history that Comrade Eddie has been elucidating. So then the 80s in South Africa could be characterized as a decade of struggles for people's power. Where mass movements in various sectors in the community, students, youth, women, trade unions, took the center stage in terms of fighting against apartheid, using their own local demands and linking those demands with the ultimate demand to end apartheid. Now, I have structured my talk in three phases. The first phase is the immediate post-war until 1960. And the second one is from 1973 until 1990. The last one will be from 1990 until 1994. So I hope to run quickly through those three phases. So it will be similar to what Comrade Eddie has presented, but with different emphasis. So the post-war period, whilst in the world it offered hope and peace, development, and freedom. In South Africa, it was almost the opposite, So immediately after the Second World War, instead of backing down on their segregationist segregationist policies and oppression of Black people, the white regime and the white politicians, they consolidated national apartheid and officially, national oppression, and officially introduced apartheid in a much more systematic way. So in 1948, the Nationalist Party wins election. The Nationalist Party is an Afrikaner party. The white community in South Africa had mainly the English and the Dutch or Afrikaans-speaking Afrikaner community. They had fought bitterly at the turn of the century in what is known as the Anglo-Boer War, fighting for South Africa. The English won, but then in 1910, the English ceded power to all the internal white community to rule on their own, even though Britain still had a lot of control over South Africa until 1960, when it became a republic. So then there was always this struggle between the English and the Boers, the Dutch. So we see in 1948, the Nationalist Party winning an election against the major party of the time, which included both the Boers and English. I think they called it the South African Party. It was led by Jan Smuts. I could be getting it wrong. So Jan Smuts had played a key role working with the Allied forces in the Second World War. But then coming back home, he gets overthrown by the Nationalist Party, which was right-wing. Now, the first thing that the Nationalist Party does is to introduce more racialist policies, in terms of Group Areas Act, as to communities could no longer live together, introducing separate amenities in all fronts, including in education, introducing a different education for Black people, Bantu education, a whole range of segregationist act policies were introduced by the Nationalist Party when it came to power. So the response of the liberation movement was to implement radical mass actions in the 50s. And the first one of these, as Comrade Eddie was saying, the first big one would have been in 1952, the Defiance Campaign, defying all of these laws. Even for buses, there were buses for whites. Even public toilets, there were public toilets for whites only. Parks, everything was separated along racial lines. So this Defiance Campaign of 1952 sought to defy all of these apartheid laws. And so many of them were arrested as a result of that Defiance Campaign. And it really shook the apartheid regime. There were also other mass actions resisting forced removals, bus rents, boycotts, even in the rural areas, peasants were rising up in the potato boycotts, So there were all range of mass actions in the 50s. And the second big one would have been the adoption of the Freedom Charter in 1955. The Freedom Charter was a non-racial document that sought to define South Africa along non-racial lines, and also sought to bring about equality in the economy, it also sought to bring about equal rights to all people and equal access to education and all amenities. So then, because the Freedom Charter was so radical, in the early 60s, in the late 50s, I think from 1958, there was a treason trial. This treason trial sought to bring the Freedom Charter to apartheid courts to say Freedom Charter was a communist document. So they had to defend it in courts of laws. To show, even though Freedom Charter was radical, advocated for nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, it was not necessarily communist, because even in the West, during those years, the governments that came into power after the Second World War, they implemented a lot of state interventionist policies that included nationalization. So then, by 1950, the apartheid government bans the Communist Party, which was a big ally of the ANC. The banning of the Communist Party was a big, a strategic defeat for the liberation movement, but they turned it on its head. The Communist Party operated underground, formed underground structures, and immediately after forming those underground structures, they helped the ANC to prepare for underground. The ANC was aware already that what had happened to the Communist Party, the banning of the Communist Party in 1950, could easily revisit the ANC anytime. And now I was still talking about the treason trial. The treason trial went on, I think, for 3 years until 1961 or so. There were about 150 leaders who were all arrested and trialed there. Now in 1960, the ANC is banned together with the PAC. PAC had split from the ANC on the grounds that they don't accept a non-racial perspective. They were Africanists. They were saying Africa belongs to Africans. Africa for Africans. That was their slogan. I think it's Marcus Garvey. Or the party of Jan Smuts, who was the leader of apartheid of South Africa, white South Africa before 1948. His party was, I was correct, was the South African Party initially, but it changed in 1934 to be the United Party. So they defeated the United Party, and Malan succeeded Jan Smuts in 1948. So then, in 1960, which is where I was, then the ANC gets banned together with PAC. The PAC was a splinter group from the ANC. They had not accepted the non-racial policy. They were Africanists. Now, it has been revealed now that from the late 50s, the apartheid regime started to interact with the American government to solicit help from them as to how could they suppress the resistance movement in South Africa, the liberation movement in South Africa. It has even been revealed that CIA played a role in the arrest of the Rivonia trialists that included Mandela in 1963. So So basically, in their biographies, most of the senior leaders of the liberation movement, including Weltasi Sulu, they say they did not see the aggression of the apartheid state developing in the late 50s. And they did not see their arrest, therefore, you know, at Rivonia. So after they were banned, then they realized that now that they are banned, they needed to go underground and have military action as part of their strategy. So then the regime realized that it needed to be more harsher. Actually, it has even been revealed that Mandela and his comrades in that Rivonia trial, they were about to be hanged. That was going to be the verdict. It was the intervention of the British Prime Minister, whose name I will remember in a while, in 1960 or early 60s, who spoke with the apartheid regime to say, don't hang them. So then, from the 60s, the apartheid regime had become vicious. It had crushed the liberation movement. So then others went to exile. Oliver Tambo established the external mission of the ANC. Even PAC had its own external mission. The Black Consciousness Movement was formed out of university students in the 60s, Steve Biko and them, Stanley Moonley and others. So then the PC, as Comrade Eddie was saying, it played that revivalist role after the banning, after the liberation movement had been crushed in the early 60s. Leaders arrested, some of them banished to exile, some of them killed, even some of them subjected to house arrests. So all manner of draconian suppression of resistance were implemented from 1960. Now, even though Black consciousness helped, but the big impetus come in 1973 when the trade unions in Durban organized big strikes because Black people were also disallowed from forming trade unions, even though they had trade unions in the 40s and 50s. But after 1960, they were never allowed. But then in 1973, they form their own trade unions, even though they were not allowed, and they start strikes. And from 1973 throughout the 70s until 1979, that's an important period because we see both workers and students organizing big mass movements that are engaged in big mass struggles and mass actions on the ground. In 1976, we see high school students taking to the streets to challenge Bantu education, particularly Africans, as a means of instruction. Again, in 1977, the apartheid regime becomes vicious. It bans all of these mass movements of the time, and it kills some of the leaders. It detained many of them in apartheid jails and even locked many of them to Robben Island, the jail where Mandela served most of his sentence. So then, in 1975, we see another revival. New mass movements are formed. The Congress of South African Students, a high school student organization that I was later to join in the late 80s, gets formed in 1979. AZASO, another students' organization for university students, gets formed in 1979. 1983, we see the formation of UDF. UDF is formed initially as a response to coordinate mass struggles, because there were many mass organizations on the ground, but there was no agency that was coordinating them. So initially, UDF comes about as the apartheid regime is once more becoming more vicious. In 1979, P.W. Botha becomes prime minister and later state president. I think it was only in 82 or 83 South Africa started using the executive president title as the head of state. So he becomes that in 1982, having been prime minister in 1979. The first thing that he does, P.W. Botha, when he assumes office, he says there's a total onslaught from black communities who are trying to resist apartheid. And he says we need a total strategy to respond to these mass struggles. He says this total strategy by government has to be holistic. It must include the military, economic matters, communications, social policy, everything, So then they established, it was there, the State Security Council was there from the early 70s, but it was playing an advisory role. But then this State Security Council, once he assumes power, it becomes like the de facto cabinet. The cabinet is reduced into a subcommittee of this State Security Council. It has other structures below it as well. It controls the defense, the police and the intelligence and all government departments. But how it operates is that it is not necessarily operating legally, so it can't be held accountable by parliament. Its activities are therefore overt. They are not known in the public. So we see a police state being strengthened from 1979 when P.W. Botha takes office. But he also has reforms. So whilst he intensifies vicious repression, he also implements reforms that try to win legitimacy for his apartheid states. So he had a minister, Minister Korenov. He tasked him to introduce an array of new laws that must amend apartheid. So these bills were called Korenov bills. There was even a constitution in 1983. This constitution, instead of the old parliament that just has one house, this one has three houses, the tricameral parliament. There's a house for whites, house for coloreds, house for Indians. Blacks are excluded, who are the majority. Africans are excluded, who are the majority. Instead, in the cities, he creates urban city councils that include black people. Or rather, he creates township urban city councils, in Johannesburg, for instance, there would be the Johannesburg City Council and then Soweto City Council for black people in the township. So he does that in 1983. So UDF, this becomes the first action of UDF to mobilize against these laws. to say Indians and coloreds. Coloreds in South Africa are your mixed race. You know, I think that's how you would refer to this racial group in the US. Here in South Africa, we say coloreds. And I know in the US, coloreds means blacks, you know, or would include blacks. So then the mobilization is such that around 80% of coloreds and Indians don't participate in the tricameral elections of 1984. So the legitimacy that he wanted in these minority communities, he does not get it, you know, in the colored and Indian communities. And then another big factor as well in the 80s is the formation of COSATU, a trade union, a federation of trade unions. So before COSATU, there was FOSATU, Federation of, I'll remember the abbreviation now, what it stands for, but it's FOSATU. FOSATU, Federation of South African Trade Unions. Yes, there was FOSATU. Now, FOSATU, even though they were militant, but they did not link worker struggles with community struggles. And as well, they did not want to align with liberation forces, you know. So it was a problem for other trade unions to participate in that. Then there's another one again, Federation of Trade Unions, of Black Trade Unions. It was CUSA, Council of Unions of South Africa, I think. NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, in which Cyril Ramaphosa, this Cyril Ramaphosa, who's bourgeois today and a billionaire, who's our president, he was in the National Union of Mine Workers, together with James Mutlatsi and others. So he was General Secretary, James Mutlatsi was president. So NUM becomes a very militant trade union from the outset, but it is in CUSA. CUSA is not militant as a federation. You know, it is dominated mainly by Black consciousness affiliates or union adherents rather. It is dominated by Black consciousness adherents. So it does not connect very well with communities. It is not as militant. And this frustrates NUM. So towards 1985, there's talk about a new federation that is going to be militant, that is going to be involved in community struggles, that is going to be involved in the national liberation struggle as well. That's how COSATU comes about, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. So when it gets formed, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, there's this book written by two stalwarts of the ANC, who are also intellectuals, Mike Maharaj and Paulo Jordan. This book gives a very good outline of the repression, the security and nature of the state in the 80s, as well as mass movements. I would recommend that comrades get it. Now, Cyril makes a speech at COSATU Congress because he's one of the organizers, conveners. He says a giant has been born today. This giant is going to crush anyone who stands on its way. So it becomes a powerful speech about this giant. And indeed, COSATU becomes a giant in the 80s and early 90s. I mean, COSATU could call a strike. The whole country would come to a halt in the 80s and early 90s. I remember one of the biggest strikes of the National Union of Mine Workers in 1987. It brought down the country and the capitalist economy because mining was still very big at the time, and it shut down the country. So students as well, in 1985, and from 1984 and 1985, they engaged in very intensive mass struggles against apartheid education, presenting their demands to improve apartheid education, but looking forward towards a people's education. So civics as well, they push boycotts, bus boycotts, and rent boycotts, and all sort of boycotts in the township. The ANC issues a statement in 1985 to say, render apartheid, make apartheid unworkable, render the country ungovernable. You know, so the townships, so it becomes difficult for the apartheid government to run the country in a normal way. The townships become storm zones of popular power. The army gets deployed even in our schools. I remember 85, 86, would be in a class, there would be a soldier or a police person. So the security forces in the state intensify repression. By 1990, it becomes clear that they can't continue in the old way. Then they unban the ANC, Mandela gets released. So the clever thing that the ANC does is that it inserts itself, because they came from exile out of the country. They insert themselves within the popular movements or mass movements that were there. You know, the trade unions, the community organizations, the women, the youth, and so on, students. And the regime attempts between 1990 and 1994 to make sure that the outcome of the 1994 elections is such that they don't get too much defeated. They still emerge with some veto, you know, out of those elections. They still emerge with some relative power. So they sponsor violence in the townships, you know. The hit squads which were there continue to kill comrades, even though the ANC was unbanned. I skipped the part of hit squads, you know, how vicious the apartheid regime became in the 80s, that they even had hit squads where they would arrest comrades and ban them. So I don't know if I did say that the security apparatus were not operating in a legal way. They were operating, even though they were part of the state, but their methods were extra legal, you know. So then between 1990 and 1994, there's like a low intensity warfare that they sponsor in the township, but they don't succeed because mass movements are strong. Violence gets suppressed a bit by 1994, elections are held and they get defeated. They did hold their own referendum in 1992, where they were testing the opinions of the white community. Now, the last point to comment about Trump and the US. Now, obviously, Trump did not just suddenly emerge in 2016 when he was first elected. It's part of the crisis of the establishment parties in the US, both the Democrats and the Republicans. We could see already with the Tea Party, was it 2008, that the right wing had started to seriously organize and mobilize, And again, what helped Trump is that the US democracy is highly controlled by the ruling class, in the military, in business, of late finance, in the CIA as well, So the emergence of Trump was gradual. It has something to do with the fact that both the Republicans and Democrats could not revive the economy as well. They could not stabilize the American capitalism locally and its hegemony globally. So it is in that context that Trump emerges. So like all fascist forces, they always emerge during the worst crisis of capitalism, same as Hitler during the interwar years. So that's why when Trump comes for the second time now, he is doing away with the old neoliberal order of free trade, of free market. He wants to intervene ostensibly for the Americans when he's doing it against the majority of the Americans, but going to benefit the business classes. So whilst Trump, we don't know if he'll be elected in the next elections or what,
Technically, he couldn't be. By the Constitution, he's not even.
Oh yes,
yeah,
he's not allowed. He's
right.
not allowed. We don't know how much repression he is going to institute between now and then, So my advice to comrades is that an analysis of the Trump phenomenon is important to understand it historically and how it is developing. And only mass movements are going to defeat it. And clearly, the parliamentary parties are discredited, both of them. So workers in trade unions, students, community organizations will have to be the base where comrades concentrate. And defiance campaigns are going to be important. At every turn, he must not be allowed to do as he pleases. And in no time, the next election may be on the horizon. But for as long as the mass movements don't organize themselves with a vision that will exit the country from the current crisis, another Trump may emerge.
Right.
So it's important that as you organize to resist Trump today, a longer-term vision is formulated that is anti-capitalist, that looks towards socialism within the concrete historical conditions of America in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of how the state is operating there. I think I should stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Eddie, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still with you.
Oh,
Come
okay.
again? Oh,
I'm still with you. Can you?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
We can hear you. We were
Okay.
concerned that when your screen went black, that we had lost.
No, it kept on rejecting me coming in and coming out. So I thought, man, let me try just by switching off the camera and see what it does. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we want to thank both of you for taking the time, providing the analysis, and making the interventions. I'll start with a question, and maybe we can take one from each of us. I'm sitting there thinking you guys gave basically both of you gave like a 50-year analysis of how you got to the point, starting from, I would say, like the Freedom Charter, but got to the point where there was a consistent and coherent vision from the mass movement that was able to push the apartheid regime out. Unfortunately, we don't have that in the United States, right? And we have to do roughly, 50 years of work, I would say, in about 5 months. So that is going to be a major challenge. We have, as I'm sure you both have seen, some major demonstrations that have emerged. There was a No Kings protest that happened the 18th of October, which got close to between 7 and 8 million people out on the streets, throughout the United States. But it did not have a coherent set of demands. So I want to ask you all briefly, so we can get more questions in. How do you all think we should utilize this kind of upsurge that's clearly coming, from the people? But how do we get it to move towards strategic demands based upon your experience? And was there a period in South Africa that you all would highlight that maybe mirrored this period where there was mass resistance, but they weren't clearly articulated demands? And then how did the movement kind of coalesce to then develop those demands and then move in a coherent fashion? So if that's either one of you, if you want to take that question.
Ed, did you want to start?
I think we lost Eddie.
Is it?
Yeah, I think we lost.
Okay. Like I was saying, so from from 1973 to 1976, we had an upsurge of mass movements, workers and students and communities, youth, But then 1977, the regime crushed all of those movements. It banned them. But we didn't get tired. 2 years later, new organizations emerged again, new student organizations, new civic organizations, new trade unions. And every time, there's always an attempt to have students would have their own demands as students that are immediate to their education institutions, the same as workers. Communities would have their own demands that are local. But the great thing was always to link these demands with a broader struggle for national liberation. So then, as these struggles continue, then when the call for UDF emerges in 1983, that call has resonance because already these mass movements, that are mobilizing in sectors and in localities, they are already engaged in struggles that are linked with the national liberation struggle, but they don't have a coordinating agency. So UDF plays that role. COSATU in 1985 plays that role. Now, I remember there was a historic a resolution of the student movement in 1984 of Student Worker Alliance to say, how do we link our demands as students with the demands of workers? You know, but all of this, it always happens in the immediate, in the concrete conditions prevailing at the time, with some radical vision of the future, of course, you know. But then you never know how the regime is going to respond. In 1985, again, the regime crashes these movements, you know. It bans the Congress of South African Students and a few other organizations. It introduces a state of emergency, meaning at any time they could arrest a comrade, lock them up without detain them without a trial for a protracted period, torture them. And that demobilizes organizations. So students, again, after COSAS is formed, they formed other local organizations. In 1988, in my township, we formed the Tabong Student Congress. Tabong is the name of our township. COSAS had been banned, so we formed Tabong Student Congress. We formed Tabong Youth Congress, you know. So we fight for the immediate local issues, but we link them with the broader national goal. Then, after UDF is banned, as Comrade Eddie was saying, we say, okay, these mass movements plus COSATU, they are mass democratic movement. We have another UDF type of an organization, but we call it with a different name. Then they realize that they have to unban, they can't suppress political organizations of Black people. Instead, they have to negotiate their way out of power. It would be better that way. Then they unban, they lift the banning on the ANC, and they released Mandela in 1990. Still, even though we're in conditions of legality, we intensified mass struggles. In one paper I wrote, I said that was the last push between 1990 and 1994. So it struggles all the way, using local and structural demands, linking them with the longer term goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Danette. Did we lose Eddie or is he back? Can we get him in for one final word? It looks like he's not on.
I think we lost him.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you so much for joining us
Before
today.
I go, sorry, can I also ask you?
Yes.
Our time is coming to an end. So, what is the state of? I do see sometimes in the American universities there's protest about Palestina, and that's good. But what is the state of the organizations and communities? I mean,
I think we're going to need a whole other session for that one. That's a very big question.
Yeah, it's a very
and
big
in fact, I do think that, we should do a second session because you gave us a lot of information regarding just the historical process, and especially in terms of the regime, the strategies and tactics of the regime, and especially the extreme repression, as well as the ability of the movements to continue to come back from that. But I think that there's so many more questions I have in terms of the internal dynamics of the movement, how folks were able to navigate the, the different ethnicities, the different, like you said, the trade unions versus the student movements. There's just so much rich um, practice and experience that I think we need to learn from, and can apply today. So hopefully we'll be able to do a follow-up session where we continue to have those discussions. And Eddie, if you're able and back and you want to say a few final words, we'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll wrap up.
And just the last comment, P.W. Botha, the last apartheid ruler before declared, was like Trump. He was a street fighter, only that he came, he was a defense minister before he became the prime minister. So he used the security state from that base of having been a defense minister, but he had many similarities with Trump. He was a street fighter, so he had no regard for rules.
It looks like
Yeah.
we lost Eddie, unfortunately.
Again.
But one thing I definitely want us to take up doing a part 2, give ourselves a little bit more time. I think
Yeah.
if we do some cross exchange of questions, Gwinnett, because the U.S. is in a very particular place right now that I think bears a lot of analysis, and unfortunately, I don't think even amongst the left there is a kind of coherent assessment of where we are at. I think it's something that we're working towards, but it's going to take some struggle. And I think hopefully this series and some of the questions that you pose to us will get us to kind of sharpen up, some of our thinking and reply, and we can have much more of, I think, of a direct exchange, and maybe bring in some other people into the conversation who might represent some different views, so that we can do a much more thorough, I think, exchange. Because one point I do just want to intervene that you made me really think about is I think the we hit a major crisis in 2008, and outside of, I would say, maybe the Greeks in Syriza, there was no major left response of a left force coming into power to really challenge and put something forward contrary to the neoliberal order. But it was clear that order ended, but the old folks who caused the crisis were left to then manage it. Trump came in, I think, to kind of, from a perspective of the ruling class and an element of the masses in the United States, to try to resolve it, but he did not have the tools nor the knowledge of how to do so. He didn't have control over the state apparatus. So that was kind of, you would look at it, it was a 4-year kind of trial period. And now he's back with a vengeance, with some clear dictates and a clear program of how to resolve that crisis. And I think one of the things that we need to talk about more is the nature of how capitalism is shifting, and has shifted since 2008, that we see in the alliance that he now has with the tech lords. He didn't have that 4 years ago, right? But they are now firmly on board with him. And there's not just a marriage of convenience, I would argue. It's a marriage of ideological alignment, at least for a section of them, 2 of which, you guys have thrown our way to cause trouble, i.e. Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. Like, y'all should, we need to get them back. Y'all should have them back.
Yeah.
But we
it's a
need
remnant
to
of apartheid, that one.
Yeah. And their worldview, from the experience of that you're sharing, is what they brought to the United States, even though there's been an interplay of American segregation, American apartheid informing South African apartheid. So there's a cycle that we got going on here that we both have to figure out how to break and build a broad international that's really going to lead us there. So let's set that up for a future time. But I think now we need to wrap up. Joe, I don't know if you wanted to get in there and intervene and close anything out with us, but I turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. A very rich conversation, and totally agree at the end there, Kelly, that what we're facing basically is an attempt at system change from the right, in that we have not offered strongly enough a new order and model that could replace neoliberalism, and that's part of what we got to do in terms of responding to this new attempt to reshape things that we're seeing very clearly from the neo-fascist right. Gannett, Eddie, who I don't know is with us, but thank you so much. That was rich and powerful testimony and history. I think people understand what we're trying to do with this series. This is not about transposing directly the experiences of a particular time and place. Everywhere is different, but there are genuine patterns that can emerge and lessons that can be read over. And so we thank you deeply. This is an exercise in solidarity and knowledge exchange. We hope we don't have to come knocking on your doors for sanctuary, but we'll see where things take us next. We will continue the conversation about South Africa. We intend to go elsewhere in the world. We're going to go to Latin America, I think, and we're going to explore Brazil, Argentina. We're going to go to Asia with Indonesia and keep digging in on what we can do and what we can learn from the experience of comrades all around the world as we try to build peacefully and non-violently both the resistance and what needs to come next when we clear away all this junk and actually start to establish a pathway forwards towards a more livable, sustainable, equitable, peaceful, and righteous future. So thank you, Gannett. Thank you, Eddie. Thanks to my comrades, Kelly and Edgar. And we look forward to seeing you for the third session in this series. Bye now. Go in peace.
Thank you, comrades. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.